What if every war, every economic collapse, every divisive political movement was part of a plan? A plan not conceived by humans, but by something far older, far colder, and far more calculating. For centuries, the same symbol has appeared in every major culture: the serpent, the dragon, the reptile. What if this isn't a coincidence, but a fingerprint? The fingerprint of the Alpha-Draconians, a reptilian race that has ruled from the shadows since the dawn of human history. They don't need to invade. They already own the board, and we are the pieces. This is how they operate, and this is how we can break free. Among all the alien races whispered about in secretive circles, none carry the same weight of dread, fascination, and mystery as the Alpha-Draconians. Described as towering, reptilian beings with an ancient presence stretching across galaxies, they are said to be one of the oldest extraterrestrial species in existence, beings who witnessed the birth of stars, seeded civilizations, and, in darker accounts, enslaved worlds. To some, they are conquerors. To others, they are overseers, pulling the strings of human history from the shadows. The very name Draconian conjures images of dragons, serpents, and the primordial archetypes of fear that haunt humanity's myths and religions. Stories of serpent gods, winged demons, and reptile overlords surface across cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Could these myths be distorted memories of actual encounters with this race? Or are they symbolic echoes of something buried deep within the human psyche? What makes the Alpha-Draconians so compelling is not just their alleged appearance or power, but their agenda. In countless accounts, they are portrayed as masters of manipulation, thriving on hierarchy, domination, and control. They are said to infiltrate governments, influence human societies through fear, and wage wars not with armies alone, but with the subtle engineering of division. Where humans see chaos, the Draconians see strategy. And yet, their mystery is layered. Some claim they are not simply invaders from the stars, but ancient custodians of Earth, present long before humanity rose from the dust. Others suggest they see themselves as rightful rulers of this planet, regarding humans not as equals, but as resources, pawns in a cosmic chess game far older and larger than we can imagine. This introduction is not meant to convince you of their existence, but to invite you into the enigma. The Alpha-Draconians may be literal extraterrestrials, archetypal shadows of humanity's darker side, or a blend of both. But regardless of interpretation, their story forces us to confront the most unsettling of possibilities: that humanity is not alone, and that our history, our freedom, and even our future may have always been influenced by an intelligence far older, far more cunning, and far more calculating than we ever dared to believe. The journey ahead will unravel their origins, their agenda, and the enduring mysteries that surround them. A story as much about ourselves as it is about them. For to study the Alpha-Draconians is to hold up a mirror to humanity's deepest fears, our struggles for sovereignty, and our unyielding quest to know the truth. The origins of the Alpha-Draconians. When myth and astronomy meet, a map appears, one that some researchers believe points not to a fairy tale, but to a family tree. The Alpha-Draconians, as they are named in modern lore, are often traced back to the long, cold arms of the Draco constellation. For millennia, human eyes have studied those stars. Thuban, in particular, holds a special place in this story. Around 2700 BCE, Thuban was the pole star, a fixed point in the sky that ancient builders used to align great monuments. It is easy to imagine how a brilliant, unblinking star could be woven into a culture's sacred geography. It is harder to dismiss the idea that, for some peoples, those bright pinpricks were not just celestial waypoints, but markers of something else entirely: origin, ancestry, or the homeland of the dragon people. Whether this is poetic coincidence or a hint of a deeper truth depends on the lens through which one reads the heavens. In accounts that attempt to reconstruct a draconian prehistory, the Alpha-Draconians are not a late arrival in the cosmic family tree. They are ancient, older than many species that now claim the title of civilization. Some narratives imagine them as a branch of reptilian evolution that diverged long before mammals gained dominance on their own planets. With long lifespans, slow metabolic rates, and a capacity for both individual cunning and collective strategy, these beings are portrayed as evolutionary survivors, not merely adapted to their environments, but architects of worlds. Their biology is described in different ways across testimonies, but certain features recur: armored scales, powerful limbs, a facial structure that mixes predatory features with an intelligence unmistakably alien to human eyes. Eyes with vertical pupils, reflective membranes like those of nocturnal predators, and mouths capable of both delicate manipulation and overwhelming force are motifs that appear again and again. But biology alone does not make an empire. What sets the Alpha-Draconians apart in lore is their social design, a rigid hierarchy that prizes command and cohesion. Imagine a civilization where rank is biological as well as cultural, where size, age, and whole lineage prestige determine one's station. In such systems, leadership is not merely political, but encoded into the very genetic line. The Alpha in Alpha-Draconian suggests more than a name. It implies an apex, an elite class that claims primacy not only by force, but by heritage. This caste-based structure fosters a unitary will that, across legends, explains how a reptilian people could organize starfaring fleets, colonize distant systems, and maintain influence for millennia. Technology in these reconstructions blends the physical and the esoteric. The Alpha-Draconians are often depicted as masters of both hard science and subtle energies, crafting starships that fold space, manipulating genetic codes to fashion hybrid servitors, and harnessing psychic or quantum phenomena in ways that appear as magic to less advanced species. Their vessels are described not as simple metal shells, but as biomechanical entities, living ships grown in vats, or guided by engineered symbiotes. In this vision, draconian tech is an extension of their biological instincts, adaptive, resilient, and perfectly suited for long-term dominion. Where human empires burned bright and went out, draconian polities endured, their slow cultural rhythms allowing for projects and plans that spanned centuries. Conflict inevitably becomes part of any long-lived civilization story. The Draconian chronicles, those assembled from myth, testimony, and speculative reconstruction, speak of ancient wars, internecine struggles within reptilian ranks, and colossal confrontations with other starfaring cultures. Some tell of a time when draconian expansion met resistance from coalitions of species that prized diversity and freedom. Others tell of draconians seeding worlds with controlled populations, engineering compliant servitor races to mine resources and maintain outposts. These narratives often cast the Draconians as imperialists whose mastery of genetics and cognition made them natural conquerors. Yet the picture is never monochrome. Within those civilizations, there may have been dissenters, Draconians who balked at conquest, who argued for trade and diplomacy over subjugation. Legends preserve both the tyrant and the dissident, and in that duality, we see a people complex enough to be real, whether or not they are literal. One of the most persistent and provocative elements of Draconian origin stories is the idea of interference, a deliberate shaping of younger species, including humanity. In many versions of the tale, Draconians are not content to passively observe. They experiment, they splice genes, they introduce myths, they implant leaders. The motives attributed to such behavior vary. Some narratives are cynical and instrumental. Earth's biosphere is a resource, humanity a workforce, psychic energy a harvest. Other accounts hint at motives more intricate, an attempt to stabilize a volatile system, to save certain knowledge from extinction, or to create hybrid guardians to defend against threats unknown. Whatever the intention, these alleged acts of genetic manipulation are used to explain anomalies in human development, sudden leaps in tool-making, inexplicable bursts of architectural sophistication, the abrupt rise of dynasties claiming divine descent. For followers of this theory, the ancient serpentine gods who taught agriculture or medicine to early kings could have been not gods but tutors, technicians, and technicians' heirs. The archaeological record is, of course, contested terrain in this conversation. Skeptics point out that human cultures are perfectly capable of inventing myths and attributing technological change to divine patrons. Also, there is no conclusive fossil evidence of reptilian humanoids or of technological artifacts that unequivocally predate known human craftsmanship. Yet proponents counter that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when deliberate concealment, cultural erasure, and the vast span of geological time are factors. They note, for instance, how easily oral histories can preserve details that later find echoes in archaeology, and how ancient monuments align to stars and cosmologies that may have held coded knowledge pointing to contact. This interplay between skepticism and speculation is an essential framing device. It keeps the origin story tethered to human ways of knowing while leaving room for the extraordinary. Genetics plays a starring role in many modern tellings. The idea that our genome bears traces of external tinkering is a powerful narrative because it offers an anchored, testable claim. Stories say that Draconians, capable geneticists, may have introduced particular markers into human DNA to create leaders who could bridge both worlds, human enough to integrate, different enough to interpret commands or to steward certain lines of knowledge. Bloodline myths, royal families who claim descent from gods or dragons, are woven into this hypothesis as cultural memories of engineered ancestry. Critics rightly point out that genetic variation can be explained by natural mutation and selection. Yet the persistence of these royal myths across unrelated cultures remains a point of fascination and invites investigation. Whether literal or symbolic, the motifs of dragon blood and inherited authority played a role in cementing social hierarchies for millennia, and that social effect is itself a kind of genetic legacy, transmitted not in DNA, but in culture. If we accept, for the sake of narrative exploration, that the Alpha-Draconians had both motive and means to interfere with other species, we must still ask, why Earth? Some stories suggest our planet offers unique resources, biological diversity, a hospitable climate, or a rare psychic resonance. Others argue that Earth was strategically positioned, a crossroads between star routes, a useful waypoint, or a newly habitable world ripe for terraforming. More esoteric tellings posit that Earth's crust bears crystalline structures that can store and amplify consciousness, making it valuable for species that feed on or harness consciousness itself. These ideas border on metaphysical speculation, but they echo across multiple testimonies, forming a feedback loop between mythic imagination and modern techno-spiritual thought. Culturally, the Draconians are often described as master archaeologists of social order. Their approach to other civilizations is sometimes paternalistic, sometimes predatory. They understand symbols and rites as governance tools, and thus some researchers argue the proliferation of serpent imagery is itself a form of soft control, embedding reverence and fear into the cultural substrate. Where the Draconians could not rule openly, they installed myths, priests, and half-remembered rituals that kept populations oriented toward obedience. Where they could rule, they often did so through elites, kings and priesthoods who wore the stories of descent like armor. This dual approach, myth as subtle governance, elites as visible administration, creates a durable system of influence that can survive the disappearance of direct contact. From this vantage point, history appears less like a sequence of discrete human achievements and more like an ongoing negotiation with older intelligences skilled at long-term planning. Yet to this portrait of domination, there is always a counter-narrative, the one of resistance. Legends preserve tales of revolts, of humans and allied species rising against draconian overlords. These stories often crystallize in flood myths, upheavals, and cataclysms, cosmic purges that reset the balance of power and scatter the draconian presence into secrecy. Such tales resonate for a reason. Even the most durable empires fracture under the weight of internal contradiction and external pressure. If the Alpha-Draconians did once hold overt sway over multiple systems, the historical logic suggests they would have faced oppositions, coalitions of species, ecological collapse, or even internal moral schisms that forced them underground or into subtler forms of influence. This pattern of rise, dominance, and retreat is mirrored in human history and lends a familiar rhythm to the Draconian saga. The origin story remains a mosaic of astronomy, biology, myth, and motive. Whether the Alpha-Draconians are literally an ancient reptilian civilization from the Draco arm of the sky, a complex cultural archetype, or a hybrid of the two, their story raises crucial questions about causality and memory. Did star maps inspire mythology, or did mythology inspire star maps? Did engineered lineages shape kings, or did kings invent stories to cement their power? The answers are not neat. They are layered and ambiguous, like strata in an archaeological dig, each layer offering fragments that might fit together if we are careful, imaginative, and honest about the limits of our evidence. What matters is not proving the impossible right away, but learning to read the traces with humility and curiosity. From here, we will move from origin into the theater of contact, examining alleged encounters on Earth, the archaeological hints, and the testimonies that make the Alpha-Draconian story not only an origin myth, but an active, unsettling presence in human affairs. Historical encounters on Earth. If the Alpha-Draconians left fingerprints on human history, those marks are smeared across the oldest stories we have. When we open the ledger of ancient civilizations, there are recurring entries: serpent gods, sky serpents, feathered dragons, and rulers who claim descent from celestial serpents. These accounts are not all identical, but their echoes are loud enough to demand examination. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of written history, serpents slither through the oldest epics and priestly records. The Sumerian pantheon included creatures and gods associated with wisdom, water, and boundaries, domains often symbolized by snakes. The image of a being who brings knowledge, law, or agriculture and then retreats into secrecy recurs. To the modern imagination, these scenes can read like parables. To those constructing a draconian hypothesis, they are possible eyewitness testimony encoded into myth and ritual. Moving east, the Indian subcontinent preserves another rich archive of serpent lore. The Nagas, serpentine deities who live underground or in watery realms, appear in Vedic and later Hindu stories as complex figures, sometimes dangerous, sometimes protective, often custodians of secret knowledge and treasures. Temples dedicated to Nagas are found across South Asia, and their iconography is woven into lineage claims and temple rituals that persist to this day. The dual nature of the Naga, as healer and threat, mirrors the ambivalence found in other serpent traditions. Creatures who can grant immortality or bring ruin, instructors of kings or causes of droughts and plague. Whether these are metaphors for natural forces, social structures, or memories of visitors, their persistence suggests a deep cultural significance that resurfaces across epochs. Across the oceans, the Americas supply their own serpent-shaped testimonies. The great Mesoamerican cultures, Olmec, Maya, Aztec, enshrined feathered serpents like Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan into the core of cosmology. These gods were culture bringers credited with teaching agriculture, astronomy, and calendrics, skills that transform small tribes into cities and engineers of pyramids aligned to the heavens. That same sense of a tutor god who imparts civilization and then becomes an object of ritual reverence or fear fits comfortably into the pattern we are tracing. In public monuments, the feathered serpent adorns stairways and temple facades, a visual program reminding citizens of an origin story in which a serpent being plays the founding role. Whether those stories formed independently or as part of a broader cultural memory remains a question. What is clear is that the image is potent and deliberate. East Asia brings a different yet connected strand. The Chinese dragon, unlike the Western fire-breathing monster, is often a benefactor, a symbol of imperial power, rainfall, fertility, and cosmic harmony. Emperors traced their legitimacy to dragon lineage. Dragons were both guardian spirits and representations of sovereign authority. The dragon's ambivalence, capable of benevolence but also deserving of worship and deference, reflects how societies encode power into mythic form. In this light, one can see how stories of reptilian patronage might have been used to centralize authority, whether that authority came from human rulers claiming divine descent or from more mysterious origins. Across Europe, dragons populate folktales and legend as adversaries to be vanquished by heroes. At first glance, this seems like a different narrative. Dragons as obstacles, not tutors. But even in these tales, dragons guard treasure, knowledge, or resources, and are linked to the subterranean and the liminal. In many medieval accounts, dragon slaying is not purely heroic. It is also an act of social reordering. The removal of an old power to make way for a new order. Folklorists argue that dragon myths served moral and social purposes, teaching courage, defining kingship, and reinforcing cultural norms. Yet when we step back, a pattern emerges. Across times and continents, serpents and dragons are tied to power, secrecy, and transformative knowledge. The question that binds these threads is not whether dragons existed as players, but why so many societies make them central in the stories that explain who governs and why. When we move from myth into the historical and archaeological record, the lines blur further. Monumental architecture, megaliths, ziggurats, pyramids, shows a preoccupation with the heavens. Alignments to stars, solstices, and constellations are common in sacred architecture, and it is no surprise that people reading those alignments through a draconian lens see coded messages pointing to a shared reference frame, one that might have been inspired by beings from the skies. In some places, oral histories and later written chronicles recall times of teachers who descended from the heavens and instructed humans in metallurgy, irrigation, or social law. These narratives, whether symbolic or literal, have shaped identity and governance for millennia. Fast forward to the modern era, and the imagery takes on new coloration. Beginning in the 19th and especially the 20th century, with the rise of modern ufology and the global exchange of ideas, serpent-like aliens enter a different cultural context. Witnesses in the post-war era began describing humanoid reptilian figures in accounts of close encounters. Often these narratives shared specific physical details, slit pupils, scaled skin, a vertical stance, as well as behavioral patterns, dominance, negotiation, and secretive operations. Abductee testimonies sometimes recount genetic experiments, implantations, or silent oversight of human breeding programs. Whether these reports are literal descriptions, symbolic dream logic, or a mix of both is fiercely debated, yet they signal a continuity. The reptilian figure did not die with classical myth. It evolved, adapting its story to the technologies and political anxieties of the modern world. One of the more persistent modern motifs is the idea of subterranean or hidden bases. Across continents, there are claims, some fringe and some made by people with military or government backgrounds, about tunnels, caverns, and complex facilities beneath the earth where non-human intelligences and human collaborators meet. These tales often involve technology far surpassing public knowledge, as well as covert projects that weaponize or commodify biological and psychic phenomena. Whether these places exist as physical sites, psychological symbols of the hidden state, or both, their presence in the narrative is important. They offer a geography for secrecy, a place where public history can be separated from hidden agency. A related theme is that of elite collusion. Many modern stories claim that certain human lineages, royal houses, or secret societies have maintained contact with reptilian entities across generations. These claims are typically framed with the language of bloodlines, rituals, and oaths. Their purpose, in narrative terms, is to explain how certain families retain disproportionate access to power. Skeptics rightly point to the social utility of conspiracy narratives. They simplify complex systems of power into human-scale stories with identifiable villains. But proponents counter that elite myth-making, promulgated by art, ritual, and symbols, can function as the soft architecture of control, whether or not an external species is involved. It's essential in this chapter of Encounters to balance wonder with restraint. Human imagination is rich and self-propagating. Ideas feed on cultural anxieties and technological metaphors. When flying saucers entered popular culture, the Serpent adapted, taking on spacecraft, bioengineering labs, and interstellar politics. This adaptability is not surprising. Myths always reflect the era that retells them. What started as river spirits and sky gods can, over centuries, become geneticists in hidden laboratories. Yet the core themes, authority, secrecy, and the ambiguous gift of knowledge, remain remarkably stable. At the same time, personal accounts cannot be brushed aside as mere cultural echo. There are stories from individuals, farmers, pilots, former military personnel, whose descriptions are identical in details that are not part of mainstream imagery. These testimonies often arrive with personal cost, ridicule, loss of status, or social isolation. Whether their claims are ultimately corroborated by physical evidence or not, they form the modern register of a much older conversation. Some researchers gather these narratives as ethnographers gather folk tales, looking for patterns and cross-cultural echoes. The patterns, again, are persistent enough to at least warrant careful listening. Two final ideas color this chapter. First, the notion of reciprocity. If the Draconians offered knowledge, what did they take in return? Myths hint at tribute. Golden offerings, human labor, obedience, psychic energy. Second, the persistence of resistance. Every narrative of domination that includes lastingly oppressive rule also includes stories of rebellion. Throughout folklore, history, and modern testimony, there are tales of people fighting back, of uprisings that scatter secret networks, of prophets who expose hidden cabals, of floods and fires that erase dominant architectures. These tales reassure us that influence is rarely absolute. The agenda of the Alpha-Draconians. If origins explain who the Alpha-Draconians might be, then agenda explains why they matter to us. The question of motive is the hinge on which every theory swings. Do these beings seek dominion, survival, knowledge, or something stranger still? Across testimonies and mythic echoes, a handful of recurring themes appears: control, resource acquisition, genetic stewardship, and an appetite for influence that reads like long-term political strategy. Whatever the truth, the stories coalesce around the idea that the Draconians are deeply interested in shaping the trajectories of other civilizations, and Earth, in many accounts, sits squarely within that interest. The most straightforward rendition of their agenda is one of control. In this telling, the Alpha-Draconians prefer order, hierarchical, clean, and efficient. Their cultural logic prizes stability, clear rank, and centralized command. From that perspective, human societies, messy, fractious, full of unpredictable impulses, are impositions to be managed. The tools of such management are familiar to any political scientist: institutions, narratives, incentives, and coercion. But the Draconian toolbox, as described in lore, includes subtler implements: myth-weaving, ritual propagation, and the insertion of trusted human intermediaries who can translate alien goals into earthly policy. Where brute force is too costly or visible, myth and ceremony are cheaper and more durable. A population that reveres a lineage or ritual is easier to guide than one that resists every command. Closely linked to control is the theme of resource extraction. Earth's biosphere is abundant in ways that many star systems are not: fresh water, complex ecosystems, and, perhaps most importantly in many modern accounts, human consciousness itself represent resources that can be used, converted, or harvested. Stories range from the literal to the symbolic. Some claim the Draconians mine physical materials and metabolic byproducts. Others argue they harvest, or at least feed upon the psychic energies generated by human emotion, particularly fear and submission. This latter idea, often criticized for sounding metaphysical, nonetheless recurs across disparate testimonies. Battlefields, catastrophes, and mass fear events are described as energetic bonanzas that correspond with increased draconian activity. Whether this is literal or a metaphor for political opportunism depends on one's interpretive framework. But the convergence of reports suggests that the draconian interest is not merely territorial, it is also energetic and systemic. Another cornerstone of the alleged agenda is genetic engineering. If the Draconians possess both the motive to guide and the means to modify, then manipulating genetic lines becomes a logical strategy. In many narratives, draconian influence manifests not in open occupation, but in the shaping of human elites, lineages that claim divine descent, dynasties that insist on purity of blood, priesthoods that guard hidden rituals. By introducing specific genetic markers or by fostering cultural practices that isolate and preserve certain lines of inheritance, the argument goes, an external power can ensure a class of humans who are especially receptive to its governance. This is the more epidemiological reading of the old royal blood myths. What looks like divine right is, on this view, the product of deliberate selection and biological tinkering. Control and genetic stewardship dovetail into the next item on the agenda, political infiltration. Across the literature, the most worrying accusation is not that reptilian beings arrive in starcraft and conquer cities outright, but that they have embedded themselves within the structures of human leadership, sometimes covertly, sometimes wearing human faces. The language of shape-shifting that often appears in modern accounts functions as a dramatic metaphor for a more mundane phenomenon, the idea that elites, whether through pacts, rituals, or biological hybrids, may serve agendas not entirely aligned with the public good. Secret societies, backrooms, and arcane rituals become the theater where human complicity and alien interest intersect. The precise mechanism, blackmail, technology exchange, promised longevity, or outright indoctrination, varies by testimony, but the pattern remains the same. Power begets leverage, and leverage creates loyalty. Equally central to the draconian narrative is the manipulation of conflict. War, scarcity, and social disruption are not merely side effects of human history for some theorists. They are tools. A destabilized society is more malleable. Scarcity creates dependence. Dependence creates compliance. The draconian tendency toward hierarchical order finds in conflict the means to reorder societies according to plans that serve them. This argument does not require that the Draconians pull every trigger. It simply requires that they apply influence where it yields the greatest systemic change. Propaganda, seeded ideologies, and engineered crises are as effective as fleets when your goal is to realign civilization over centuries rather than months. Yet the agenda ascribed to these beings is not exclusively malign in every telling. Some narratives present a more complex motive structure, stewardship, preservation, or even a truncated benevolence. In these versions, certain draconian factions perceive themselves as guardians of a fragile cosmic ecology, aware that civilizations unchecked tend to self-destruct, and so intervening to steer species away from catastrophic technological or ecological errors is, in their calculus, a form of tough love. This paternalist approach reframes their interventions as a cold pragmatism. The universe is a harsh place, and long-lived species might take extreme measures to ensure stable, survivable neighbors. The moral ambiguity of such a stance is obvious. Who appointed anyone to decide another species' fate? But it does explain the recurring contradiction in reports. Sometimes Draconians are portrayed as teachers who impart knowledge, other times as taskmasters who demand tribute. Alongside these practical motives sit more esoteric ambitions. Several modern accounts suggest the Draconians pursue knowledge for its own sake. Archaeological, biological, and cosmological. Earth, with its deep evolutionary history and complex biosphere, is a repository of unique genetic and cultural data. Researchers who indulge this theory imagine draconian scientists cataloging life, experimenting with developmental pathways, and preserving genetic libraries. In this view, Much of the alleged coldness is scientific professional detachment. To a draconian biologist, humans might be subjects of study rather than moral agents. Again, whether this is an ethical failing or a methodological stance depends on perspective. From ours, it can seem monstrous, even if their point of view is clinical rather than sadistic. A related and far more disquieting possibility is strategic survivalism. Long-lived empires across the cosmos, according to some reconstructions, have learned a brutal lesson. The universe is indifferent, and threats arrive unpredictably. Thus, they adopt policies of redundancy and long-term planning that seem alien to humans focused on short horizons. Establishing client states, creating genetic reservoirs, and embedding influence in multiple systems are all survival strategies. The draconian agenda, through this lens, becomes less about immediate profit and more about securing contingencies for millennia. Short-term costs, human suffering, ecological disruption are tolerated because the long-term objective is species continuity and dominance. All of these motives converge into a practical program that believers and witnesses describe in overlapping terms. Hybrid programs that mix draconian and human DNA, covert manipulation of religious and political institutions, secret technologies traded to secure elite compliance, underground installations that serve as research hubs and control centers, and a cultural strategy that keeps populations deferential through ritual and symbolism. The cumulative effect is what many fear most: a hidden architecture of governance that operates beneath and sometimes within the visible state. It is a world where public consent can be manufactured, where dissent is redirected or suppressed, and where the true architects of policy are obscured by layers of myth and bureaucracy. Of course, the most important piece of this puzzle is not the agenda itself, but the human reaction to it. Whether we treat these accounts as literal confessionals or symbolic renderings of our anxieties, they expose a powerful truth. Humans have always worried about being governed by forces beyond their control. The draconian narrative crystallizes that worry into a single, coherent antagonist. It furnishes a target for our fear, someone to blame for inequality, secrecy, and the ossified structures of power. In doing so, it can be politically mobilizing. Stories of hidden rulers invite resistance and reclamation. This possibility gives rise to two crucial ethical dilemmas. The first is epistemological. How do we separate paranoid projection from genuine revelation? The second is political. If such influence exists, what moral duty do humans have to resist? Activists and truth seekers answer the latter with calls for transparency, accountability, and the dismantling of unaccountable networks. Spiritual seekers answer with inner work, raising consciousness to deprive predatory forces of the energies they purportedly feed upon. And practical investigators answer with evidence gathering, FOIA requests, whistleblower protection, and interdisciplinary research that ranges from archaeology to genetics to the sociology of secrecy. Ultimately, the draconian agenda, regardless of its literal truth, forces us to reflect on agency. Are we autonomous actors in our own story, or do older architectures of power still shape the script? Even if the Alpha-Draconians are mythic or symbolic, the systems they represent are painfully real. Hierarchies that prefer obedience, institutions that thrive on secrecy, and elites who preserve advantage across generations. Whether the enemy is reptilian or merely human, the fight is the same: reclaiming human dignity, transparency, and the right of self-determination. The portrait of the draconian agenda is complicated and uneasy, a mix of cold calculation, long-term survivalism, and occasional paternalism. It explains, in narrative terms, why certain patterns in human history repeat, why elites entrench, why myths justify power, why conflict often benefits those who sit unseen. Whatever the case, the stories surrounding this agenda perform a valuable cultural work. They ask uncomfortable questions about power and prompt us to imagine resistance. Next, we will move inside the creature's society, examining reported hierarchies, internal factions, technology, and the difference between Alpha-Draconians and the broader family of reptilian species. The Alpha-Draconian hierarchy and society. When people picture an alien empire, what often comes to mind is a single image: Ranks of identical soldiers marching under a banner, an iron-fisted ruler on a throne. The Alpha-Draconian model is neither cartoon nor simple autocracy. If anything, accounts and reconstructions suggest a civilization woven from biological determinism, ritualized authority, technological stewardship, and fierce cultural memory, a society that treats order as both religion and survival technique. To understand their methods is to understand how a species could hold influence for ages without always resorting to open conquest. At the heart of draconian social structure is hierarchy made manifest. Rank is not merely symbolic, it is reinforced through physiology, ceremony, and law. Elders, often literally larger, more scarred, and slower moving, occupy positions of counsel and command. These elders are repositories of institutional memory, the living libraries of lineage, tactics, and long-range plans. Mid-level castes perform administrative and military functions. Strategists, engineers, and priest scientists who translate elder mandates into action. Lower castes, sometimes specialized for labor-intensive tasks or bioengineered for particular environments, maintain the infrastructure of draconian power. This rigid stratification produces a society capable of coherence across centuries. Decisions are vetted, rituals mark transitions, and dissent is routinized into designated channels so that rebellion, when it does occur, becomes visible early and manageable. Monarchy or oligarchy? The answer varies with the testimonies. In some renditions, an alpha line, genetically distinguished and ritually sanctified, sits atop a throne that is at once political and sacral. In others, authority is distributed among a council of matriarchs and patriarchs, whose legitimacy derives from ancestral continuity and demonstrated mastery of genetic or technological arts. What remains consistent is the centrality of blood and memory. The past is not past, it is law. Dynastic rituals, lineage songs, sealings, and genetic rites ensure that authority is inherited with ceremony and that knowledge transfer is encrypted in cultural performance as much as in genes. Warrior culture is another prominent thread. The Draconians are often portrayed as valuing martial excellence and strategic dominance, but theirs is not a romanticized warrior ethos. It is practical, institutional, and professionalized. Warriors are trained to fight across atmospheres, in vacuum, and in psychic arenas where will and perception count as much as bullets. Military academies, in that picture, are laboratories of discipline where physical training meets mimetic conditioning. Recruits are schooled in tactics that privilege patience and long-term advantage. This martial bent is balanced by an administrative class that plans resource extraction, diplomacy, and the slow cultivation of human proxies, showing how force and policy interrelate in a civilization built to persist. Religion and ideology function differently among the Draconians than among humanity. Rather than a pantheon of gods, their rituals often center on ancestor veneration, tactical cosmology, and rites that bind biological continuity with technological stewardship. Ceremonies celebrate successful gene lines, the birth of engineered castes, and the refinement of symbiotic technologies. In many accounts, rituals serve a dual purpose, marking socio-political transitions while serving as practical maintenance of engineered systems. Ritual gestures that also calibrate biomachinery, songs whose frequencies tune living ships, oaths that bind neural implants to communal networks. The line between worship and engineering blurs in a society where life and technology are designed to be continuous. Technology in Draconian society is not merely a set of tools, but an extension of social organization. Starcraft are grown and bred as much as built, with organic hulls that respond to the touch of compatible pilots. Cities, where they exist in open form, are engineered for longevity. Subterranean vaults hewn into planetary crusts, orbital habitats with self-repairing biofilms, and resource nodes defended by layered defenses designed to outlast transient assaults. Their laboratories are vast, combining old-fashioned material science with genetic weaving and what we would call information ecology. In such a system, engineers are priests, and priests are engineers. Knowledge is guarded, cataloged, and distributed according to rank and need. One particularly striking element of Draconian society is its approach to language and memory. Oral tradition remains central, but so too does encoded genetic memory and mnemonic technology. Elders are said to carry sequences of symbolic knowledge that can be activated in chosen descendants. Ceremonies are used to link cognition to crystalline or bioorganic storage mediums. Whether literal or metaphorical, this emphasis on multiple channels of memory explains the endurance of their planning. When a culture invests in redundant memory, ritual, genetic material, it becomes very difficult to extinguish. The Draconian worldview produces a distinctive economy, one that privileges preservation over consumption. Long-term resource planning replaces short-term profit. Agricultural domes are designed to regenerate for millennia. Energy systems recycle waste into usable forms. Populations are managed not by market forces, but by quotas calibrated to planetary carrying capacity. In human contact zones, this economy often looks parasitic, extractive projects disguised as trade or aid, but within their own polity, it is presented as prudential governance. Maintain reserves, limit volatility, steward resources for future contingencies. To outsiders, this can feel cold. To insiders, it is survival. Relations with other reptilian or non-reptilian species are complex. The Alpha-Draconians are not monolithic. They have sibling races, client species, and long-term rivals. Some Draconian factions favor tight control and expansion, others favor diplomacy and trade. This creates internal tension and periodic schisms. Integrationists argue for alliances, interspecies cultural exchange, and genetic blending as adaptive strategies in an unpredictable cosmos. Hardliners argue for purity, strict hierarchy, and strategic dominance to prevent dilution of Draconian lineage. These ideological splits produce political fault lines, coups, exile of dissidents, and the occasional formation of breakaway colonies with their own social experiments. Hybridization, the mixing of Draconian traits with other species biology, is a pragmatic policy and a source of social contention. In some sectors, hybrids serve as intermediaries, more palatable to humans, yet genetically resilient to Draconian demands. Hybrids occupy liminal roles: diplomats, overseers, and in some stories, the custodians of secret knowledge who can move between societies. But hybrid programs are ethically fraught within Draconian discourse. Purists decry dilution and contamination. Pragmatists argue hybridity is necessary for long-term survival. The moral calculus of hybridization reveals how a civilization's self-conception shapes its approach to others. Are you a sovereign, a species, or an ecosystem steward? Internal justice and enforcement are administered through a combination of ritual adjudication, genetic markers of culpability, and technological surveillance. Trials are ceremonial and exacting. Punishments can be physical exile, genetic recalibration, or reconditioning. Because identity is strongly tied to lineage and rank, crimes are often framed as betrayals of ancestral memory rather than mere rule-breaking. This conflation of social, spiritual, and legal norms creates a powerful adhesive for social cohesion, but it can also ossify corrupt practices and justify harsh measures under the banner of continuity. Cultural life among the Draconians is richer than the caricature of cold militarism would suggest. They make art, geometric, reptilian motifs woven into tapestries, soundscapes designed for low-frequency resonance, and sculpture that doubles as data storage. Their storytelling prizes strategic narratives, parables that teach patience, tales that encode tactics, histories that are both celebration and warning. Family life, to the extent it exists in familiar forms, revolves around lineage houses that function as both domestic units and institutional nodes, places where children learn crafts, history, and the specialized rites that will determine their caste. The interface with humans is where Draconian social systems become most opaque and controversial. Within contact narratives, a pattern emerges. Draconians favor indirect governance through local elites rather than open dominion. This is sensible if the cost of occupation is high and the benefit of subtle control is enduring. Having human leaders who internalize and broadcast draconian-friendly myths is more efficient than stationing legions. This strategy requires careful cultivation, marriage alliances, credit for technological marvels, or cultural gifts that create gratitude and dependency. It is an approach that privileges the long game. But no system is stable forever. Fissures appear in the form of dissident houses, exiled reformers, and cross-species coalitions. Some Draconians who have seen the benefits of interspecies cooperation argue for transparency and partnership. Others, older in thought and scarred by past wars, hold to precautionary dominance. These conflicts cannot be entirely hidden from humanity when they produce choices that touch human lives. Which rulers are uplifted? What genetic projects proceed, whether a base is opened or closed? Thus, the Draconian socio-political life, though layered and secretive, leaks into the human record in many subtle ways. Finally, the question of decline and secrecy must be confronted. Like great human empires, Draconian polities appear to undergo cycles: consolidation, expansion, overreach, and retrenchment. Cataclysmic ecological events, protracted wars, or the rise of coalitions can push them into hiding or force a strategic pivot toward covert influence. In such periods, they become masters of subterranean life, vaults, shadow networks, and long-view planning, all of which make them harder to detect and easier to attribute to myth. The picture that emerges is of a civilization that is calculated, ritualized, and eminently strategic. Its strengths, long-term planning, integrated biotech, and rituals that bind generations, make it durable. Its weaknesses, ideological rigidity, internal factionalism, and ethical blind spots, explain why the Draconian story contains as many schisms as empires. Understanding this society is crucial to assessing the claims about their agenda and their footprint on Earth. In the next chapter, we will confront the mysteries and controversies head-on. Whistleblower testimonies, the problem of evidence, competing interpretations, and the uncomfortable question of whether some of our most compelling myths are misread history or the last recorded memory of a presence that refuses to die. Mysteries and controversies. Any investigation that straddles myth, testimony, and shadowy politics inevitably collides with uncertainty. The Alpha-Draconian narrative sits at that intersection, and the fog of secrecy makes it fertile ground for both revelation and fabrication. In this chapter, we confront the hard questions. What counts as evidence? How much of the story is projection, and how much might point to something real? Can oral traditions and whistleblower accounts be reconciled with the sterile demands of archaeology and genetics? The answers are provisional, and the work of sorting them requires humility as well as curiosity. One of the central mysteries is the problem of physical evidence. To date, mainstream archaeology has not produced an unequivocal draconian skeleton, an artifact that bears unmistakable non-human manufacture, or an inscription that reads like a blueprint for hybridization programs. For skeptics, this absence is decisive. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and the Draconian thesis has not cleared that bar. Proponents respond with two counter-arguments. First, deliberate concealment is plausible. If a powerful group benefits from hiding evidence, they have motive and means to bury, sanitize, or mislabel it. Second, some evidence is ambiguous by nature. Star alignments, anomalous genetic markers, and mythic motifs can be read many ways. When a stone precisely aligns to Thuban, is that proof of draconian contact or the result of careful ancient astronomy? The ambiguity persists. Whistleblower testimony adds another layer of controversy. Over the last several decades, a stream of former military personnel, government contractors, and insiders have come forward with stories of underground facilities, non-human prisoners, and covert bioengineering projects. These accounts often converge on certain motifs: hierarchical collusion, compartmentalization, and a doctrine of secrecy that forbids public disclosure. They are disturbing and sometimes detailed, yet they are also difficult to verify. Memory is fallible, documents can be forged, and personal motives are complex. For researchers, the challenge is methodological. How to weigh testimony that, if true, would rewrite history, but that often arrives without corroborating physical proof. A related controversy concerns the role of modern media and culture in shaping the narrative. Science fiction, film, and internet communities have created a rich ecosystem of reptilian imagery. Critics argue that this cultural soil fertilizes confabulation, dreams, hypnagogic episodes, and genuinely strange experiences get woven into pre-existing templates that the culture supplies. A person undergoing a profound psychological crisis might draw on watery, reptilian imagery that is culturally available. That does not make their inner world any less real, but it complicates claims about external visitation. Proponents of the Draconian hypothesis counter that cross-cultural consistency, stories of serpent overlords appearing in traditions separated by continents and millennia, cannot be explained away solely by modern media contagion. The truth may sit between. Ancient patterns interact with contemporary myth-making to produce the stories we now hear. Another unresolved puzzle is the shape-shifting motif. Many accounts claim that Draconians can assume human form, either through technology, hybrid bodies, or psychic camouflage. This motif performs powerful symbolic work. A being who looks like you but is not you is the perfect metaphor for corrupted leadership. From a literal perspective, shape-shifting raises thorny biological and physical questions. How could such rapid morphological change occur without violating known biochemical constraints? Some theorists propose advanced nanotechnology, holographic projection, or targeted neural influence that alters perception. Others suggest the reports describe selective masquerade, humans in draconian suits, engineered hybrids that read as human in daylight, or controlled illusions. The literal mechanics are speculative, but the psychological impact is clear. Shape-shifting stories amplify the sense that enemies can hide in plain sight. Psychic phenomena and claims of energetic harvesting are perhaps the most contentious elements. Stories that depict beings feeding on fear or manipulating human emotions test the boundaries between metaphysics and metaphor. To materialist scientists, such claims register as untestable. To spiritual practitioners and some experiencers, they are consistent with experiential reality, an energetic economy in which consciousness itself is a substrate for influence. Again, the disagreement often comes down to epistemology. What modes of evidence are accepted? Controlled experiments in parapsychology have produced mixed results over decades, leaving a contested field where ideology often substitutes for rigorous consensus. The Draconian accounts sit squarely in this disputed terrain. The social consequences of embracing or rejecting the Draconian narrative are non-trivial. For believers, the story illuminates hidden patterns of exploitation and offers a moral framework for resistance. For skeptics, it can look dangerously close to scapegoating and conspiracy mongering. This tension matters because myth can catalyze political movements. When complex social problems, inequality, corruption, ecological collapse are narrated as the product of a shadowy reptilian cabal, responsibility can be displaced from human institutions to an otherworldly enemy. The ethical line between diagnosing systemic injustice and inventing cosmic villains is thin and must be navigated with care. Despite controversies, certain lines of inquiry remain productive. Interdisciplinary research that brings anthropology, comparative mythology, genetics, and open-source investigative methods together can illuminate how draconian motifs spread and why they persist. Oral histories can be recorded and compared, anomalous architectural alignments can be cataloged and dated, genetic studies can examine claims about unusual markers, always with careful controls, transparency, and peer review. Even if such work yields only partial correlations or negative results, it advances understanding and reduces the domain of pure speculation. A different kind of mystery is internal to the Draconian narrative: the existence of dissenting voices within the alleged reptilian polities. Testimonies suggest that not all Draconians agree on human policy. Some factions reportedly advocate for transparency and mutual coexistence. Others insist on domination. If true, this internal friction could be the key to understanding apparent inconsistencies in contact stories. Why one account describes teachers while another describes tormentors. It also opens ethical possibilities. If there are factions sympathetic to human autonomy, alliances could be imagined that change the balance of influence. Whether this is wishful thinking or a real strategic leverage point is unclear, but it reframes the problem from one of monolithic evil to one of political negotiation. Finally, we must confront the hardest question. What would constitute proof? Would a draconian artifact in a museum, verified by multiple independent labs, settle the matter? Would genetic markers traceable to a non-terrestrial origin be decisive? Or would the interpretive malleability of myth allow denial to persist, even in the face of hard evidence? Human history shows that entrenched narratives can survive contradictory proof. Beliefs are resilient. Thus, the aim of investigation should not only be to seek decisive artifacts, but to create robust public procedures for evaluating claims, transparent methods, open data, and cross-disciplinary scrutiny. That is the only route to epistemic humility and genuine progress. Humanity's response, resistance, awakening, and the path forward. If the Alpha-Draconians are truly an influencing presence on Earth, whether in the shadows of our governments, in the echoes of our myths, or in the deep anxieties of our collective unconscious, then the most pressing question is not whether they exist, but how humanity chooses to respond. History has shown us that the power of a narrative is not only in its literal truth, but in its ability to shape behavior, inspire resistance, or induce submission. This chapter focuses on the possibilities of response, ranging from resistance movements to spiritual awakening, and explores the tools humanity may already possess to break free from any manipulative control, terrestrial or extraterrestrial. The call to resistance. Resistance begins with awareness. If a hidden influence thrives on ignorance, then education, whether formal or grassroots, is its antithesis. Communities around the world that suspect outside interference often emphasize waking up as the first act of rebellion. In the draconian context, this means encouraging people to look beyond surface appearances, question authority structures, and recognize patterns of exploitation. Whether one believes in literal reptilian overlords or not, the call to resist corruption, secrecy, and manipulation resonates with profound urgency. Resistance can take many forms. On the political level, it might mean demanding transparency from governments, investigating covert programs, or pushing for declassification of sensitive archives. On the cultural level, it might involve creating art, literature, and media that expose hidden power structures and empower collective imagination. On the personal level, resistance often looks like reclaiming one's own agency, refusing to live in fear, seeking truth independently, and cultivating resilience. The legend of the Draconians thus becomes more than a story of alien control. It becomes a metaphor for every form of tyranny that feeds on compliance. Spiritual awakening and inner defense. If Draconians are said to manipulate human emotions, especially fear, then the deepest form of resistance may not be military or political, but spiritual. Many traditions across the globe emphasize that fear is both a cage and a source of energy that can be harvested by others. Learning to master fear, to transmute it into courage, compassion, or clarity, can be seen as the ultimate weapon against entities that thrive on low vibrational states. Meditation, mindfulness, and energy work are often framed as tools to close the gate against parasitic influence. Experiencers of alleged draconian encounters sometimes report that invoking love, calmness, or spiritual authority interrupts the intrusion. Whether one interprets this as psychological self-stabilization or as a literal disruption of energetic feeding, the principle remains powerful. Sovereignty begins within. A humanity that refuses to be ruled by fear would be much harder to manipulate, no matter the source of the attempted control. Unity is counterbalance to division. One of the alleged strategies of draconian manipulation is divide and conquer. By fostering conflicts between nations, races, religions, or even ideologies, humanity expends its energy fighting itself rather than confronting hidden influences. The antidote is unity, not in the sense of homogenization, but in cultivating solidarity across differences. Movements that emphasize global cooperation, ecological stewardship, and shared human dignity become revolutionary acts in this context. By seeing one another not as enemies but as kin, humanity undermines the very strategy that would keep it weak. This is easier said than done, of course, but even small gestures of unity, a dialogue between opposed communities, a grassroots alliance for climate action, or a local project that bridges cultural divides, chip away at the structures of division that may serve hidden agendas. Scientific inquiry and disclosure movements. Another path forward is through disciplined investigation. For centuries, mysteries have thrived in the gap between experience and evidence. Today, however, humanity has tools that can narrow that gap: genetic sequencing, advanced astronomy, open-source intelligence, and crowdsourced analysis. If the draconian narrative has substance, then consistent anomalies should appear in these domains. For instance, geneticists might uncover non-terrestrial markers in human DNA. Archaeologists might identify anomalous construction techniques that defy explanation. Astronomers might detect patterns of interest around stars like Thuban. The push for government disclosure fits into this strategy. If there are archives of suppressed data, photographs, biological samples, or testimonies, then releasing them would enable humanity to move from speculation to evaluation. Even partial disclosure could galvanize further research and democratize access to truth. The difficulty, of course, lies in overcoming entrenched systems of secrecy that benefit from silence, yet history has shown that truth can only be delayed, not destroyed. Preparing for direct contact. Whether draconian or otherwise, the possibility of direct contact with non-human intelligences forces humanity to consider readiness. Are we prepared, as a species, to face beings that may not share our values, morality, or appearance? Direct contact would not only be a scientific event, but a psychological and cultural earthquake. Preparation, then, involves building resilience against shock, cultivating cultural narratives that do not immediately default to fear, and fostering leaders who can respond with wisdom rather than panic. The contact scenario also raises ethical questions. Should humanity negotiate with such beings if they demand subservience? Or should resistance remain non-negotiable? If factions exist among Draconians, should alliances be considered? These are not abstract questions. They are rehearsals for choices that may one day be real. Humanity's preparation depends on cultivating a mature planetary identity, seeing ourselves not as fragmented nations, but as a single species capable of making collective decisions in the face of external forces, the mythic opportunity. Finally, the draconian story itself, whether literal truth, symbolic narrative, or some blend of both, offers an opportunity. Myths are not merely falsehoods, they are carriers of meaning. To confront the image of a powerful, reptilian overlord is to confront the shadow within humanity itself, the capacity for domination, cruelty, and exploitation. By wrestling with this myth, we are invited to recognize and resist the inner draconian, the part of ourselves that seeks control at the expense of compassion. In this sense, humanity's response is not only outward, but inward. To resist the Alpha-Draconians is to resist our own impulses toward hierarchy and violence. To awaken spiritually is to commit to empathy, justice, and collective flourishing. The myth, therefore, becomes a mirror. The more we understand what we fear, the more we can choose who we become. Humanity's future between shadow and light. The story of the Alpha-Draconian race is not simply a tale of alien intrigue. It is a mirror held up to humanity at a crossroads. Whether these beings are literal extraterrestrials hidden in the corridors of power or archetypes embodying humanity's deepest fears of domination, their presence in our collective imagination forces us to ask, what kind of species do we want to become? This chapter explores possible futures, ranging from dystopian outcomes of continued manipulation to hopeful visions of awakening, sovereignty, and cosmic partnership. The dystopian path: submission and control. If the darker claims about Draconians are true, then the worst-case scenario is one in which humanity continues to live under their influence without ever recognizing it. Such a path would mean deeper layers of surveillance, economic dependency, and spiritual enslavement. Fear would remain the dominant energy, harvested generation after generation. In this dystopian vision, human leaders would essentially serve as proxies, figureheads whose policies maintain division and conflict. Wars would never cease, ecological collapse would accelerate, and technological advances would serve control rather than liberation. A population anesthetized by entertainment and distracted by trivialities would remain blind to the strings being pulled. The risk here is not only physical domination, but the erosion of the human spirit, the quiet acceptance of a diminished destiny. The evolutionary path, awakening, and autonomy. But there is another trajectory, one already hinted at by the rising number of people questioning official narratives, exploring spiritual practices, and building communities outside mainstream structures. In this future, humanity learns to recognize patterns of manipulation, whether they come from hidden elites, cultural conditioning, or possibly extraterrestrial forces. Awakening does not necessarily mean violent rebellion. Rather, it means a collective decision to live differently. Instead of feeding systems of fear and control, people cultivate resilience, kindness, and independent thought. Technology is used not for domination, but for transparency and empowerment. Science expands into consciousness studies, bridging the gap between material and metaphysical. Spiritual traditions, once fractured, find common ground in the principle of sovereignty and compassion. On this path, the Alpha-Draconian story transforms from a tale of oppression into a catalyst for growth. The more we wrestle with the archetype of the reptilian overlord, the more we sharpen our collective will to choose freedom over submission. The hybrid future, negotiation and integration. Some researchers and experiencers suggest a third possibility, that contact with draconian beings does not have to remain adversarial. Just as human history is full of empires and tribes that began as enemies but later forged treaties, it is conceivable that factions within the draconian hierarchy might one day seek peaceful relations. This hybrid future would be delicate. It would require humanity to present itself as a unified and dignified species, capable of dialogue rather than submission. Negotiations could involve the recognition of shared territories, exchanges of knowledge, or even collaboration in larger cosmic affairs. Skeptics might dismiss this as naive. Why would a dominating species suddenly compromise? Yet the possibility remains that, like humans, Draconians may not be monolithic. Some may see domination as unsustainable and may prefer coexistence. If humanity matures enough to stand as equals, such negotiations become imaginable. The inner transformation, facing our shadow. Ultimately, the most profound future trajectory may not be about external aliens at all, but about how humanity integrates the idea of the Draconians. Every myth, whether literal or symbolic, serves as a mirror. In the Draconian myth, the mirror reflects humanity's own shadow, our capacity for greed, domination, and cruelty. Facing that shadow is essential. If we externalize it entirely, projecting all evil onto alien overlords, we risk ignoring the ways in which we perpetuate exploitation against each other and the planet. But if we see the Draconian archetype as both external threat and internal reflection, then resisting them means transforming ourselves. A humanity that transcends its own inner draconian impulses, its thirst for domination, its addiction to fear, its exploitation of the weak, becomes ungovernable by any outside force. Such a humanity would not only be free, but would radiate a new form of power, the power of conscious, compassionate, sovereign beings. Finally, it is worth widening the lens. If the universe is as vast and populated as many believe, then the Draconians are only one thread in a much larger cosmic fabric. Other beings, benevolent, neutral, or indifferent, likely exist. Humanity's future, then, is not simply a choice between enslavement and freedom, but an initiation into the responsibilities of galactic citizenship. How we handle the Draconian question, whether by succumbing to fear, rising into sovereignty, or learning to negotiate, will shape how other civilizations perceive us. Will we be seen as prey, as peers, or as partners? The answer depends not on the Draconians, but on us. The power of myth, storytelling, archetypes, and the Draconian narrative. Whether one sees the Alpha-Draconians as literal extraterrestrial beings or as symbolic constructs, there is no denying the immense influence their story exerts on human imagination. Across cultures and centuries, humanity has told stories of serpents, dragons, and reptilian overlords. These tales endure not because of physical evidence, but because they resonate with something deep in our psyche. Chapter 8 explores how myth and storytelling shape human consciousness, how the Draconian narrative functions as an archetype, and why these stories matter even if their literal truth remains disputed. Myth as a vessel of truth. Myths are not mere fictions, they are vessels of truth encoded in narrative form. A myth may not describe historical events exactly as they occurred, but it conveys psychological, spiritual, or cultural truths that are just as powerful. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, and the dragon-slaying tales of Europe all serve to remind humanity of struggles between chaos and order, temptation and wisdom, domination and freedom. In this sense, the Alpha-Draconian story is part of a long lineage of serpent myths. It speaks to the fear of domination by a cold, calculating intelligence, a force that lacks empathy but possesses immense power. Whether or not reptilian beings literally rule behind the scenes, the myth tells a truth about the danger of power divorced from compassion. Archetypes of the shadow. Carl Jung, the psychologist who introduced the concept of archetypes, might describe the Draconians as an archetype of the shadow. The shadow represents the aspects of humanity we reject or fear: greed, cruelty, domination, and predation. By projecting these qualities onto reptilian others, humanity externalizes its shadow. We say, it is not us, it is them. But myths are mirrors. The Draconian archetype reveals not only an external enemy, but also the potential within humanity to become reptilian ourselves: cold, hierarchical, ruthless. The story of the Draconians challenges us to recognize and integrate this shadow so that it does not unconsciously rule us from within. Storytelling as resistance. Telling stories about reptilian overlords also functions as a subtle form of resistance. Even if governments or elites deny hidden control, ordinary people use these narratives to articulate suspicion and dissent. A story about alien rulers can serve as coded language for critiquing earthly corruption. The myth gives form to the formless, providing a language to describe invisible systems of exploitation. This is why conspiracy theories, however controversial, gain traction. They offer a narrative that explains why people feel powerless in a world dominated by opaque institutions. The Draconian story says, "You are not crazy." The sense of being manipulated is real. The enemy may be hidden, but it has a face. In this way, the myth empowers those who might otherwise remain voiceless. Cultural contagion and the internet age. In the digital era, myths travel faster than ever. The idea of reptilian rulers, once confined to scattered esoteric texts and underground discussions, has exploded into mainstream culture. Memes, documentaries, novels, and films recycle the motif, sometimes as parody and sometimes with deadly seriousness. The internet functions as a kind of global campfire around which humanity shares myths in real time. The Draconian story mutates, adapts, and spreads, gaining new details and interpretations as it circulates. For some, this is proof of cultural contamination. People believe in reptilians because they saw a viral video. For others, it is evidence of disclosure, suppressed truths finally finding their way into mass consciousness. Either way, the speed of myth-making in the internet age ensures that the Draconian archetype will not fade anytime soon. The double-edged sword of myth. But myth is a double-edged sword. While it can inspire resistance and awaken awareness, it can also be weaponized. History shows that myths of hidden enemies have sometimes fueled paranoia, scapegoating, and violence. When people externalize all evil into an other, they may lose sight of the complexities of real human institutions and relationships. The danger is that the draconian narrative could become an excuse for intolerance or a distraction from real problems such as inequality, environmental collapse, and corruption that require tangible solutions. The challenge, then, is not to discard the myth, but to hold it wisely, to treat it as a story that empowers without letting it slide into fanaticism, to recognize its symbolic truths without losing sight of the material world. Myth as preparation for contact. One of the most fascinating possibilities is that myths themselves may serve as preparation for real encounters. If non-human intelligences exist and are one day revealed, humanity will need frameworks to interpret them. Myths, in this view, are rehearsal spaces for the unimaginable. They give us symbols and archetypes to help us digest realities that might otherwise shatter us. If one day reptilian beings step forward openly, humanity will not meet them as a blank slate. We will meet them through the lens of our myths, expecting overlords, tricksters, or teachers. The Draconian story, then, becomes a script that shapes our response in advance. This makes it vital that we consciously examine the story now, so that we do not unconsciously act out fear or submission later. The ongoing role of imagination. Ultimately, the story of the Alpha-Draconians reminds us of the immense power of imagination. Whether they exist in the flesh or only in our collective dreams, they have already shaped human destiny by becoming a persistent figure in our mythology. They challenge us to examine power, fear, unity, and freedom. They dare us to confront our shadows. And perhaps this is the deepest truth. Imagination itself is a form of power. By choosing the stories we tell and the ways we interpret them, humanity creates its own future. If we tell the Draconian story as one of enslavement, we risk living it. If we tell it as one of resistance and awakening, we may write a very different ending. Disclosure and its consequences. For decades, whispers of hidden files, secret programs, and government cover-ups have fueled the suspicion that humanity already knows far more about extraterrestrial life than it admits. The Alpha-Draconian narrative sits squarely in this terrain of secrecy. If there are reptilian beings influencing Earth from the shadows, then their greatest shield has been denial and concealment. But what would happen if that shield collapsed? What if disclosure, whether partial, accidental, or total, were to occur? This chapter explores the possible forms of disclosure, the immediate reactions it might spark, and the long-term consequences for human civilization. Types of disclosure. Disclosure is not a single event, but a spectrum of possibilities. At one end lies partial disclosure, where governments admit the existence of UFOs or UAPs, but stop short of acknowledging contact with non-human intelligences. This has already begun in recent years, with official reports that validate anomalous craft without addressing their origin. In the middle lies managed disclosure, where fragments of the truth are released in a controlled way, perhaps acknowledgement of certain extraterrestrial groups, while omitting more controversial ones like the Draconians. Information would be drip-fed to acclimate the public slowly, minimizing shock. At the far end lies full disclosure, where incontrovertible evidence, artifacts, biological samples, direct contact becomes public. In this scenario, the existence of extraterrestrial races, including the Draconians, would no longer be speculative. Humanity would confront a new reality overnight. The shockwave of revelation. The immediate impact of disclosure would be a psychological earthquake. For centuries, humans have believed themselves to be the dominant intelligence on Earth. To learn that another species, hidden and possibly ruling from the shadows, had been present all along would shake that foundation. Some people would experience terror, others vindication. Believers would feel validated. Skeptics might spiral into denial. Religious institutions could face crises of faith as doctrines are re-examined in the light of alien presence. Governments might struggle to maintain authority if citizens conclude that leaders had colluded with or concealed alien influence. The economic system, too, would tremble. Markets are built on trust and predictability. The revelation of hidden alien actors could trigger instability, panic, or conversely, a wave of innovation if alien technologies were revealed alongside disclosure. The fear factor. The most dangerous consequence of disclosure might be fear. If humanity were suddenly told that a reptilian species with advanced technology had long manipulated global events, many would panic. Civil unrest, religious extremism, or violence could erupt. Fear might fracture societies more deeply than any draconian agenda ever could. Yet fear could also galvanize unity. Faced with a common external presence, humanity might rally together, setting aside internal divisions. The question is which path we would choose: collapse into chaos or rally into cooperation. Political consequences. Disclosure would place enormous pressure on political institutions. Citizens would demand accountability. Who knew? Who decided to keep silent? Who negotiated with them? The legitimacy of governments could crumble if people believed leaders had acted as intermediaries for hidden overlords. On the global stage, disclosure could reset geopolitics. Nations might compete for access to alien technology, or they might unite under a planetary framework to negotiate as one species. The United Nations, or a successor organization, might become the first true planetary government, tasked with representing Earth in cosmic affairs. Spiritual and cultural transformation. Beyond politics, disclosure would trigger a profound cultural and spiritual reckoning. Humanity would need to redefine what it means to be human. Are we merely pawns in a larger galactic game, or are we sovereign beings capable of standing as equals among the stars? Religious traditions might adapt by reinterpreting sacred texts, perhaps reframing angels, demons, and serpents as encounters with extraterrestrials. New spiritual movements could arise that emphasize unity, cosmic kinship, or resistance against parasitic forces. Art, music, and literature would explode with new creativity as humanity digests the new mythos. Long-term consequences. Over the long term, disclosure could lead to one of two broad futures. In a pessimistic trajectory, humanity becomes destabilized, succumbs to fear, and accepts continued domination under a new, overt alien authority. In an optimistic trajectory, disclosure serves as a catalyst for awakening, forcing humanity to confront its shadow, claim its sovereignty, and mature into a conscious, cooperative species ready for galactic citizenship. Which path unfolds depends not on the Draconians, but on us. Disclosure would test our capacity for resilience, wisdom, and unity. It would be the greatest mirror humanity has ever faced. Empowerment and sovereignty in the face of alien influence. If the Alpha-Draconians represent domination, secrecy, and fear, then the most urgent task for humanity is to cultivate empowerment and sovereignty. Regardless of whether reptilian overlords truly exist, the narrative highlights real human vulnerabilities, our tendency to submit to authority, to fracture into divisions, and to live in fear. This chapter explores how individuals and communities can reclaim agency, psychologically, spiritually, socially, and politically, in preparation for any hidden influence, terrestrial or extraterrestrial. Personal empowerment, the inner fortress. Empowerment begins at the individual level. If Draconians feed on fear, then mastering fear is the first act of sovereignty. This does not mean eliminating fear, which is a natural human response, but transforming it. Practices such as mindfulness, meditation, breathwork, and journaling help individuals recognize fear without being ruled by it. Experiencers of alleged reptilian encounters often report that fear intensified their paralysis, while calmness or spiritual invocation disrupted the encounter. Whether one interprets this as psychology or metaphysics, the lesson is clear. Sovereignty begins within. An individual who cultivates emotional resilience, clear thinking, and self-trust becomes far more difficult to manipulate. Community empowerment, the strength of unity. While individual resilience is vital, communities are the true backbone of empowerment. Isolated individuals are easy to control. United communities are not. History shows that even empires collapse when ordinary people organize, share knowledge, and support one another. For communities, empowerment looks like open dialogue, mutual aid networks, and decentralized organization. Local resilience, whether through food systems, energy independence, or shared decision-making, creates buffers against external control. In the Draconian narrative, where divide and conquer is said to be a key strategy, every act of solidarity is a blow against manipulation. Political sovereignty, demanding transparency. At the societal level, sovereignty requires accountability from institutions. If hidden powers, human or otherwise, exploit secrecy, then transparency is the antidote. Citizens can demand declassification, whistleblower protections, and open-source research. Movements for disclosure, freedom of information, and government accountability are not fringe luxuries. They are essential defenses against manipulation. Political sovereignty also involves vigilance. If humanity ever negotiates with extraterrestrial beings, it must do so as a united species, not as fractured nations competing for favor. This means cultivating global frameworks that prioritize human dignity and autonomy over short-term advantage. Spiritual sovereignty, claiming the soul. Beyond politics lies the question of spiritual sovereignty. If the Draconian narrative is correct that these beings harvest fear and control through psychic influence, then spiritual practices are not merely personal hobbies, but acts of liberation. Prayer, ritual, chanting, and energy work, all found in different forms across cultures, serve as ways to fortify the human spirit. The key is not which tradition one follows, but the conscious declaration of sovereignty, the refusal to cede one's inner light to any external power. Many experiencers of oppressive encounters describe a turning point where they spoke aloud their refusal, invoked higher powers, or simply declared, "I do not consent." That declaration itself can be a shield. Knowledge as power. Empowerment also depends on knowledge. The more humanity understands about history, psychology, genetics, and cosmic possibilities, the harder it is to deceive. This is why education, research, and critical thinking are revolutionary acts. A population trained to question, investigate, and analyze is far less vulnerable to manipulation than one numbed by propaganda or entertainment. This is also where myth and science meet. The Draconian narrative, whether literal or symbolic, is a tool for inquiry. By studying it critically, humanity sharpens its skills of discernment. The story forces us to ask, what is evidence? How do we distinguish truth from deception? What patterns repeat across time? Each question strengthens our intellectual immune system. Empowerment through imagination. Finally, empowerment requires imagination. If Draconians embody control and suppression, then creativity itself becomes resistance. Art, music, storytelling, and play remind humanity of its freedom to create. They cultivate joy, which is the opposite of fear. They generate hope, which no overlord, alien or human, can easily extinguish. By imagining new futures, humanity weakens the grip of imposed narratives. If the Draconians thrive on humanity believing it is weak, then every imaginative act that envisions a sovereign, awakened humanity chips away at that control. In this sense, imagination is not escapism, it is strategy, a species learning to stand. Taken together, personal, communal, political, spiritual, and creative empowerment form the pillars of sovereignty. A humanity rooted in these pillars would be unrecognizable compared to today's fragmented world. It would be resilient, self-aware, united, and capable of facing external influence without collapsing. Shadows, mirrors, and the dawn ahead. The story of the Alpha-Draconian alien race is one that stretches across myth, conspiracy, spirituality, and psychology. It is a narrative of shadows, an ancient tale of reptilian overlords ruling from behind the curtain of human history, shaping empires, whispering into the ears of kings, and manipulating the very fabric of society. Whether these beings exist in flesh and blood, in interdimensional realms, or as archetypes of our deepest fears, the impact of their story on human imagination is undeniable. To speak of the Draconians is to confront the uncomfortable, that perhaps humanity has never been fully in control of its destiny. It is to ask whether wars, divisions, and the darker impulses of our nature are purely human, or whether they echo the designs of hidden hands. These questions unsettle us precisely because they strike at the core of sovereignty. Are we free or are we subjects? And yet, the Draconian narrative is also a mirror. It reflects back to us the parts of ourselves we most fear, our capacity for domination, greed, deception, and cruelty. If the Draconians exist outside us, then they are adversaries to resist. But if they exist within us as symbols of humanity's shadow, then the battle is internal. Perhaps it is both. Across this journey, one theme has remained constant: fear as control and empowerment as liberation. Whether we take the Draconians literally or metaphorically, the antidote is the same. Knowledge, unity, courage, imagination, and spirit are the tools that turn subjects into sovereign beings. When humans refuse to be divided, when they choose curiosity over ignorance, when they face fear without bowing to it, the shadow loses its grip. The mystery of the Alpha-Draconians may never be fully resolved. They may remain forever in the liminal space between myth and fact, between nightmare and revelation. But their story serves a purpose. It forces humanity to grow, to ask harder questions, to prepare for a wider cosmos where power and freedom must constantly be balanced. Perhaps one day, if humanity ventures to the stars, we will meet these beings face to face. Perhaps they will emerge from the shadows when humanity proves itself ready or too weak to resist. Or perhaps they will remain as they have always been, whispered echoes, tests of our courage, challenges to our sovereignty. But until that day, the real battle lies here and now, in the choices each person makes, and in the destiny humanity writes for itself. Whether Alpha-Draconians are conquerors of the galaxy or shadows of our own psyche, the question remains: will we bow or will we rise? The dawn ahead has not yet been written. The shadows remind us of the stakes, but the light is ours to claim. Conclusion: the shadow in the stars and the sovereignty of the soul. The saga of the Alpha-Draconians, as it unfolds across the tapestry of myth, modern testimony, and speculative history, is far more than a simple tale of alien invasion. It is a profound and multi-layered narrative that forces humanity to confront the most fundamental questions about its own identity, autonomy, and place in the cosmos. Whether one interprets these reptilian beings as literal extraterrestrial overlords, potent psychological archetypes, or a complex amalgam of both, their story serves as a crucial mirror reflecting our deepest fears, our historical patterns of domination, and our enduring struggle for freedom. The true power of the Draconian narrative lies not in its potential veracity, but in its function as a catalyst for a necessary and urgent human awakening. At its most literal level, the hypothesis presents a chilling paradigm shift. It suggests that human history, with all its triumphs and tragedies, may not be a linear progression of self-determined events, but a carefully managed script orchestrated by a cold, calculating intelligence of immense antiquity. The recurring motifs of serpent gods, dragon kings, and feathered serpents across disparate cultures cease to be mere mythological coincidences and instead become potential fragments of a suppressed historical record. This perspective recontextualizes the rise and fall of empires, the ossification of oppressive hierarchies, and the persistent cycles of conflict as symptoms of an external agenda, one of control, resource extraction, and energetic harvesting. In this light, the feeling of powerlessness that pervades modern society is not a personal failing, but a systemic condition, engineered to keep humanity compliant and manageable. Yet, even if the Draconians are dismissed as purely symbolic, their archetypal power remains undiminished. They embody the ultimate shadow of humanity, the aspects of our own nature we fear to acknowledge, the thirst for absolute power, the cold logic of social domination, the propensity for cruelty when divorced from empathy. The Draconian impulse exists within our own institutions, our corporations, and our political structures. It is the part of us that seeks to control, to categorize, to subjugate both nature and fellow humans in the name of order and efficiency. By projecting these qualities onto an external, non-human entity, we externalize a battle that is profoundly internal. The struggle against the Draconians, therefore, becomes a metaphor for humanity's struggle to overcome its own inner darkness, to integrate its shadow, and to choose cooperation over conquest, compassion over control. This duality, the literal and the symbolic, is where the narrative finds its greatest potency. It creates a feedback loop of meaning. If we act as if there is a literal force of manipulation, we are compelled to cultivate the very qualities that would render such manipulation ineffective: critical thinking, emotional resilience, community solidarity, and spiritual sovereignty. In doing so, we simultaneously combat the very real, human-made systems of oppression that the Draconians symbolize. The call to awaken and resist serves a dual purpose. It prepares us for a potential cosmic revelation while empowering us to dismantle the earthly architectures of control here and now. The proposed draconian methods of influence, division, fear-based control, and the manipulation of information are not alien concepts. They are the classic tools of tyranny throughout human history. The narrative's great insight is to frame these tactics on a species-wide, millennial scale. It suggests that the divide and conquer strategies employed by earthly empires are merely local applications of a cosmic principle. The antidote, then, is equally universal: unity. Not a bland, homogenized unity, but a conscious, celebrated solidarity that recognizes our shared humanity and common destiny. Every act of bridge building, every effort to transcend tribalism, and every choice to respond with love instead of fear becomes a direct countermeasure to the core draconian strategy, whether it is wielded by aliens or humans. Ultimately, the mystery of the Alpha-Draconians may never be conclusively solved. They may forever dwell in the liminal space between fact and folklore, but their enduring presence in our collective imagination performs an essential service. They are the perfect antagonist for a humanity standing at a precipice, grappling with ecological crisis, technological acceleration, and existential uncertainty. They provide a focal point for our anxieties, a name for the formless dread that the world is not as it seems. More importantly, they offer a clear path forward. The path is not one of violent rebellion against a hidden enemy, but of profound, holistic empowerment. It is a path of mastering our inner world to become immune to fear, of building resilient communities that cannot be easily divided, of demanding transparency from our institutions, and of reclaiming our narrative through art and storytelling. It is about evolving from a species driven by primitive impulses of survival and dominance to a conscious, planetary civilization capable of sovereignty. The story of the Alpha-Draconians, in the final analysis, is a test. It tests our courage to look into the shadows without flinching. It tests our wisdom to discern between literal truth and symbolic meaning. It tests our resilience to build a future based on hope rather than fear. Whether these beings are waiting in the dark reaches of space or are merely phantoms of our own psyche, their challenge is the same. Will we succumb to the shadow, or will we rise to claim our light? The answer does not lie with them. It has always lain, and will always lie, within us. The dawn of a sovereign humanity begins not with a spaceship in the sky, but with an unshakable declaration of freedom in the human heart.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.